Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Hunter, and I'm the Assistant Director for Student Equity and Inclusion here at Roosevelt University. And it's a pleasure to welcome you today to our intergenerational trauma and Black communities discussion. Joining us today is a fantastic group, each bringing their own individual perspective and professional opinion and perspective to our important topic for today. But before introducing our guests, I would like to take a moment to recognize what today is, or what this weekend will be, Juneteenth. This day is very, very meaningful, and it's all about celebrations. Just imagining what those slaves must have felt like to find out the news that they were finally free. I'm sure that we're going to have some great celebration, great topics talked about today. So today we come together in observance to have a great dialogue with a panel of strong voices for racial justice and healing. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, who's going to help us to help bring this dialogue to fruition, Sandra Harrison. Sandra is an entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of DVA, Leadership and Development Training Consultants. She grew her business from a startup to expert knowledge. Her venture is focused on training and development, specializing in introductional design and team building influence with play. One of DVA's primary goals is to increase access to education and training to underserviced and disadvantaged communities. Sandra is a Roosevelt alum, graduating with the Master of Arts in Training and Development, and she's a proud alumnus. Sandra, thank you for leading our discussion today.
Carl, thank you. It is a privilege to be here today. I just can't even tell you how excited I am to be here during Juneteenth and representing my alma mater, true and dear to my heart, Roosevelt University. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists because I know we have a great dialogue ahead of us today. And unfortunately, we don't have Preach the Poet online yet. So we are hoping that he and his family are okay, as we have not heard a response yet. But we will get started with the conversation with V and Dr. Sorrell. So V.L. Harrison is an award-winning journalist in Chicago. Her work appears in publications across the city, covering and highlighting Black culture and community news. She is a Chicago change agent, setting the stage for new voices in Black media. Directly after receiving her BA from Columbia College, she served as a journalism instructor for inner city youth in Chicago, promoting news, literacy, and Black-owned media. Harrison has spoken to over a dozen audiences across the nation. She recently published her first book, Hood Healing. And through the use of her personal stories and interviews with local journalists and media influencers, she exposes the impact of generational trauma on Black people living in the inner cities of Chicago. Welcome, V.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Tanya Sorel is an associate professor of psychiatry at Rush Medical Center and the assistant director at National Institute of Health, National Institute of Drug Use for their Clinical Trials Network. Dr. Sorel has worked in the field of mental health for over 25 years, in Arizona for more than 10 years, in Colorado more than 5 years, and is now here in urban Chicago. She is a licensed and board-certified psychiatric nurse practitioner who specializes in child, adolescent, and adult psychiatric medication provisions. Her doctoral training is in rural and underserved mental health and substance use research, and a minor in complementary and integrative behavioral health practices for Latino groups. Thank you both for being here with us today. It is such a pleasure to have you both. We are going to jump into our conversation.
Okay.
Would you guys both share with us what intergenerational trauma means to you, and how does your work address those histories of trauma? Dr. Sorel, let's start with you.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks to Roosevelt for having me as part of this important discussion. You know, intergenerational trauma occurs when we have the ongoing issues of stress, the ongoing trauma of everyday life, and difficulties of coping that have the origins in the past, but also the present racialized issues that happen on an individual, community, or structural path. Individual prejudice, community bias, things that we see in our media narratives, and governmental and legal historical decisions regarding groups of people, particularly Black people, and that continue to have an impact today on how those current generations are attempting to move past that. As the director of the Substance Use Disorder Center of Excellence at Rush, we really look at and focus on how gender, race, and the intersectionality of these issues make a difference and impact, unfortunately, many people in their mental health and may put them at risk of substance use, as well as how these issues impact the general population. So really reaching health equity, which was where everyone has a level playing field, begins with understanding history and these systemic factors so that we know how it affected groups in the past and now. Because if we don't know our true history, we can't learn from it or work to address the changes that we need.
Awesome, thank you. You talk about those systemic factors. Can you identify what those are? Just a few of those for our audience.
Sure, and many people, just as you say, when we have the blessing and the excitement of Juneteenth, we didn't recognize that immediately after that was Jim Crow. And Jim Crow included legal paths to disempower, disenfranchise, and prevent the development of and improvement in the development of Black lives. So just some examples include redlining. So if you weren't able to live or purchase a home in a certain neighborhood, then if you were able even to obtain a loan for a home, then the rate of growth for that home decreased. So when you had children, you didn't have the wealth that home ownership normally afforded. Or for so many Black people who served in World War II, but weren't able to utilize the GI Bill to go to college, whereas white soldiers that served in World War II were able to go to college on the GI Bill for free. They were able to get loans to purchase homes at reduced rates. But Blacks, just as recently as the 50s and 60s, didn't have access to that. Wow. And so their subsequent children were at a much farther rate behind in trying to be able to go to have the good education, to be in a neighborhood that wasn't experiencing environmental pollution, and then to be able to move forward in their own development and their own wealth, which is one way even today that Black monetary rates and how much a Black family has is less than a tenth of what the average white family may have.
Wow. V, we want to bring you into this conversation. Tell us what your thoughts are. Same question, kind of share with us what intergenerational trauma means to you and how your work right now is addressing that histories of trauma.
Absolutely. I thank you so much for that, Dr. Sorrell. That was wonderfully put. Very simply, and then I'll go into detail. I literally believe that it is the seeping of trauma in the bloodline. And when you consider the depth of traumatic experiences, people who are descendants of African slaves, those who are of the African diaspora, you realize that the majority of people around you are traumatized and they don't even know it. And so we continue our families and we continue our generations and we build and we stack on top of that trauma so bad that it's often compounded but completely missed in our families. It is until we get older when we may start realizing that perhaps growing up in my environment has traumatized me, or perhaps living with an abusive parent has traumatized me. It is literally the handing down of these traumatic experiences, and also being in our generation and not really understanding the education behind it. There's nowhere to really lay your burdens and your grief because you haven't been taught how. Typically in Black families, specifically in inner city Chicago and inner cities all over the country, people want to talk about these things, but it's very taboo, very unusual, and very shameful. So as an author of a book who really just lays it out there, I'm just very proud to be able to start some of the narrative, specifically in journalism, As a Black journalist in Chicago, I absolutely refuse to cover anything that isn't the truth in this city, and that really digs deep into why we are here, why we are seeing an outburst of violence, a decrease of care and value in life, and the trauma is literally seeping through our bloodline.
Wow, that's a very powerful visual. The seeping of, that's a very powerful visual. Dr. Sorrell, these kind of scraping the tip of the iceberg here. How is this trauma passed down? Like how does this happen?
That's a great question, and V started on that path on how does my stress impact my children's stress.
Mm-hmm.
We know, and you may have heard of it, called the fight or flight response. What I tend to use to explain it is this: if you're calm and relaxed, then you're on green light, go. Which means that your brain is operating at its best, your body and the organs in your body are operating on its best. If you're at yellow, okay, you're at you're at a little bit of higher alarm. So you're either slowing back down, or like some do at the red light, you're trying to speed forward. Either way, that puts extra stress and strain on your body and your brain. If there's red light on alert, then of course that's a complete shutdown. When we think about our everyday lives as Black Americans, we're frequently always on yellow alert. Mm-hmm. Are the microaggressions that we might see from day-to-day issues in our hair, our names, colorism, other issues, just, oh, well, you speak very appropriately. Mm. Okay. Those little things, and we feel it. You notice it in the pit of your stomach. Yeah. You're listening to something on the news, and you hear about a shooting or something, and you feel that in your pit. Oh goodness, I hope it isn't one of us. Yeah. That is moving your body to yellow alert. That means your blood pressure is raising. That means that cortisol, which is called the stress hormone, is getting released in your system. And cortisol basically puts the accelerator on all the organ use in your system. So it means you're at higher risk for blood pressure problems, at higher risk for the breakdown of some of your brain cells, at higher risk for the things that we see that happen to mostly Black people, development of diabetes, because our insulin systems start to break down. And so not only does it impact our health, and we know already there's a decade gap in the life expectancy of those that may live on the west side of Chicago than those that live on the loop or north side. We see how running on that yellow light in terms of stress makes a difference, not only in your risk of health issues, but also your health outcomes and life expectancy and quality of life. We also know that if you're running on alert all the time, the way that your brain and your DNA is developing may actually impact when you have children, so that they may be at higher risk of having medical issues, mental health issues, and living in an environment that will make those issues worse.
So I hear you saying that this can happen across all races, this type of trauma passing down. However, I hear you saying that it is magnified in the Black community.
Because we have not only the macroaggressions, so to speak, of object racism, of still overcoming issues in slavery, redlining, segregation of housing and education, but we also have the everyday stressors, so that many Black people don't know where the green light of being calm is. And so learning how to have self-care, you actually are having to, okay, am I feeling like I'm somewhat tense? And you can see your shoulders rise up. You can feel that in your heart beating faster, or that little ping in your stomach when you hear something. Oh goodness, there's been another police shooting. Right. And sadly, those things, we see these on television most days, unfortunately. And so that's re-traumatizing and keeping your system at that yellow alert where it's pushing faster, and unfortunately causing physical, mental, and emotional damage. Being able to then rectify that in finding those supports, like V said, who do I speak to this? Who do I debrief these stressors with, so that I can get back to a green light?
Yeah.
It's so important. It's so important.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I know environmentally in the same realm, V, and in your book, Gerard McClendon, who is an award-winning journalist here in Chicago, spoke about trash in the same line. Do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. So, Gerard McClendon, longtime journalist here from Chicago, former PBS correspondent. When I interviewed him for the book, it was really because I had realized that McClendon had lost his parents to a traumatic murder that happened not so long ago, about 4 years ago. But we really got off to talking about the depth of the pain in the hood. And something that McClendon mentioned was the idea of trash, literal trash, and its impact on our psyches and on our neighborhoods and on our self esteem. And so, typically, for example, if I am a young Black man from Inglewood or Austin community, west or south sides of the city, the moment I leave my apartment, my home, where my safety is, and I step into my neighborhood, there are cigarette packages and cognac bottles and trash completely surrounded by me. And so that becomes a normalcy. That type of environment and what I see on a daily becomes a normalcy. And on top of that, that teaches me how I feel about myself. So, this idea of our environment dictating who we are and our environment not getting what it needs. And what do I mean by that? As a journalist, almost 12, 13 years in the business, one thing that I have covered for over a decade in cities like Chicago and nearby cities like Indiana and Detroit are food deserts. And the issue of not having enough grocery stores in certain neighborhoods. However, if you grew up in a city like Chicago and in a neighborhood like Austin, where I grew up, Chicago's poorest, blackest, biggest neighborhood, then you will understand that grocery stores are very hard to come by. And most people have normalized this. So as Dr. Sorrell was saying, we really have this normal culture of not having what we need and not being okay. That becomes intergenerational because we teach our children that not having is okay. I literally grew up in a house where we weren't allowed to waste food. We weren't allowed to leave electric lights on longer than they needed to be. Everything was about making it. Everything was rooted in survival. When we raise our children because of our traumatic experiences, we can't break away from that. It's very tough to allow your own children to have a good time and live the spoils of life if in your own survival and your own intergenerational trauma,
Always in
you
survival.
can't break away from that.
Yeah, you're always
Very
in
light
survival.
example, but these types of instances happen in our families all the time.
Yeah.
And that survival mode that you mentioned, V, is that same high alert. So
Yeah.
you're once again burning your energy, but unfortunately not in a healthy direction. And
Dr.
even
Sorrell, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, but I want to ask, and I know a lot of your work and your work as well, B, is on the ground with young people, and we're seeing escalated violence, and we're seeing escalated drug use. How is this generational trauma showing up in today's young person?
well, just as you said, when there are few resources, then the resources that are there, unfortunately, may not be the best that can be of help. It's easier to get a hold of alcohol or drug than to get a hold of a therapist or a counselor, or to feel a comfort level in being able to use these systems where many of these past systems were used against us.
Yeah.
And healthcare recognizes, particularly what was exposed during COVID, that we need to be right there in the community and meeting people where they're at. And part of that reluctance sometimes to look at seeking mental health services is not just because they're not there and the resources aren't in that community, but also that in the past, that same resource wasn't of its best use for those in the Black community.
That's a really
And
interesting point.
And if we don't see representation, I've had patients that have seen me since we've been on video. So they see me on Zoom. I've never seen a Black psychiatric provider in my entire life. And that's another area that we know that we need to change.
So how do we help parents? And in my work, I often see a child that will penetrate an organization and have incredible need and be just as involved and have other issues within the home that they're a threat to their siblings in the home. How do we help the parents who seem to have nowhere to go? I mean, they themselves are riddled with trauma that they, as V mentioned earlier, can't quite unravel and don't really understand. How do we help our parents help their children?
I think that's a great question, Sandra. It really is the pinnacle of hood healing and what made me write this book, because there's so much divide between generations that we can't have the conversation. We can't seem to get past the anger that we have from the generation before us and the shame that we have on the current generation. And we cannot seem to get past that divide. So in hood healing, what I dare to do is I tell my own personal story of traumatic experiences in my own life to break a silence that, quite frankly, people just aren't willing to break in their families. It's like home code. And when you break this home code, you can kind of start deciphering a hood code, because what starts to happen is you start penetrating other people, and it becomes this domino effect. Oh, well, she tells her story, I'll tell mine. I'll listen to that story and I'll give mine. And so it's a give and take. And it really starts with education, really dropping that shame, because a lot of these things we die with. And some of our young people that die, they don't deserve to go. And they die with the same trauma they were born with. I wanted to read an excerpt from the book, if I could, because it really speaks to what you just said. And God, now is just the perfect time. So this is chapter 3 in my book, featuring you, Sandra, CEO of DVA Training and Development Consultants, and my mama. So the title of this is Family, Friends, Foes, and Facebook. And here I go. I'm going to start right about here. Sifting through trauma and being honest about its impact is just the start of the work. Doing things differently than what you saw at home or on the streets of Chicago is just the next step. Yeah. Leading the conversation on individual healing to inspire generational healing is sacred work. I'd rather do it now than watch my children suffer from the unhealed trauma in which I inflicted on them. Similar, yet vastly different to the trauma in which my mom inflicted upon me. As Frederick Douglass would say, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass understood the fragility of Black people. We are still fragile, still easily broken, easily scarred like the backs of our brown ancestors from chains and whips being thrashed across their flesh while white slave masters shouted out holy scriptures. Slave masters twisted the scriptures to keep our ancestors in bondage. Some of us are still in bondage. It is difficult to heal from the truth of our past when deeply embedded in our consciousness is how ugly and worthless we are. And there is no credit given for us as we continue to labor and sacrifice for a country that doesn't love us. Consider that only a decade after the end of slavery, during Reconstruction, a dozen formerly owned slaves were members of Congress. We had a Black governor, P.B.S. Pinchback, governor of Louisiana, 1872, and the first Black governor in the U.S. We knew we had the creativity, education, and cognitive ability, but it took hundreds of years of our parents being beaten to death, babies sold, and mothers raped before our brilliance was recognized. And only 10 years post-slavery did we begin to see that we had these abilities. Then enters Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation by denying Black people the right to vote, the right to an education, hold high-paying jobs, elected offices, and live in white communities. Jim Crow was another method to suppress Black achievement, another tactic to divide the culture and erase the truth. Jim Crow laws sought to exclude Blacks from every sector of society. And when we feel that exclusion, that hatred toward who we are, oftentimes we inappropriately display that pain. However, when we are brave enough to fight, we end up fighting the wrong people and displacing our anger. We hurt our children because our parents left us with pain to pass down. We hurt our siblings because they are there to take the displaced hurt. We often take them for granted. We hurt our own parents because they've caused us unapologetic and unexplainable pain. So much pain that we have trouble articulating it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. We hurt our ancestors because we haven't learned from them. We haven't learned how to heal. something that we're never allowed to do while chained to other human bodies months at a time during the Middle Passage, witnessing their kin being sold and raped. That pain is still there, and the diminishing of our ancestors' existence, the wiping away of their language, their culture, their heritage, has yet to be a lesson for us. We hurt ourselves and our own kin because we are taught to hate ourselves, and because we actually do.
Wow.
That's an excerpt from Hood Healing.
B, thank you. Just thank you. Every time I hear an excerpt from that book, it's like I'm reading it again. And Dr. Sorrell, when I listen to my child have recant her pain through parents we know love her, where do we start to unpack this and heal our families? Because if we have a generation, a young person like V, who is bringing attention to an issue, we know that there is trauma to unpack from her parents and their parents.
Mm-hmm.
How do we begin to get a sweeping idea of where to begin to unpack some of this?
You know, I think that's so important a question, and particularly when you asked earlier about the patient, the client coming to your practice. I think it's important to have the grace to understand that just as the younger generation may be suffering and may have their own anger and concerns, the older generations have that same hurt, pain, and trauma. And that even more so, part of that conditioning, when we say that's where we learn to keep family secrets, that's when we learn to push down pain and say, okay, we'll overcome it better and better by and by.
Yeah.
That was their method of coping at the time, because if they showed emotion, they could certainly get lynched, jailed, imprisoned, or killed with no ramification. And showing that there was a mental health issue or a substance use issue led to being jailed, killed, or otherwise impacted. And so there wasn't an outlet for the discussion of this trauma and pain. So older generations of Black have to recognize that they have to normalize and to have that discussion of their own healing, of their own trauma. Because now they have what they may have lived, what they saw their parents live through Jim Crow, and now feel a hurt and anger because they're not able to continue what we would want to do. Each generation wants to see their next generation rise up.
Right.
They're seeing what they may have been marching for in the 60s start to redevelop even now, which is an additional trauma for them. Oh, I expected my children not to have to go through this again.
Absolutely.
And so recognizing that all need that same grace and healing and forgiveness. So when we channel anger towards any other generation, we also recognizing that that's a misplacement of our own trauma.
Oh, wow.
And that unfortunately, we're placing additional trauma on those who at that time, at that point in their lives, may have been helpless to have made it different for the younger group.
Wow.
And so opening up to recognize, just as you said, for both the parents and the child that came to your agency, we all need healing here. Let's prioritize the immediate need. We know that suicide, unfortunately, is increasing in our youngest generation. So what do we need to do? Because that's a priority, to make sure that this person, that child can feel safe. Right. Secondly, we need to recognize and agree that both groups, children and parents, are traumatized right now.
And in most cases in homes, grandparents.
Grandparents.
In most cases, we have multi-generational families in Black homes.
Yes.
For up to 4 generations sometimes.
Yeah. Are there maybe grandparents that might still be in the South that we go to see now during the summer? You know, if they didn't come up with during that Great Migration. But certainly they're all still a part of that. And sadly, they're seeing, well, we thought when they went up north, it would be different. No, they just saw more subtle issues in racism and microaggressions, but they were still there. And so recognizing we really need to have a tiered generational healing and how we address those groups. The younger groups may be more open to expressing emotion. Those middle age, and particularly the older group, may be somewhat more reluctant. So how do we discuss that? We discuss ways in looking at regaining your health. normalizing that there is no health without mental health.
Right, right.
And recognizing that we knew, literally, just as they said, I know why the cage bird sings, if I couldn't cry unless it was beaten out of me. So your emotions were particularly suppressed.
Yes.
So how do I now learn to voice emotions appropriately?
Yes.
How do I learn that it's okay to voice pain rather than either push it down or say, well, when I meet my maker, then the pain will go away.
Wow.
Realizing that I'm literally pushing it into my blood pressure.
Yeah.
Or that I'm looking, or I might alleviate that pain by a substance use, which means I'm still self-medicating for pain.
Yeah. Absolutely. I gotta ask the question, guys, and the intergenerational fact. It is so interesting to me that sometimes we just don't even think of the impact that we have on us as a culture. And one of those situations you spoke earlier about hair, like, I understand why I'm changing my hair. Young people understand that. But when I go to take care of my mom and I take her to a doctor's appointment where her medical care team might not be of color, she wants me to do something different to present myself differently for my hair, because her generation still feels that we have that integral. So be with all of those complexities. Where do we start? Where do we start to heal our communities?
We are in a place, honestly, where very similar to most elderly people in that saying that you hear they're stuck in their ways. It's very honest to that, because in so many cases, some of their racism, believe it or not, is very justified. Some of their miseducation and some of their pain against one another, white against black, black against white, Hispanic against Puerto Rican, so many of those things are justified because history have left so many of those relationships so tattered. And to be honest, and I'm always biased when I say this, but the future of this turning around is truly in our youth. And as we spoke about earlier, all of us having this connection to young people, and there's this cliche that the children are the future, but the majority of the world, I'm going to talk specifically Chicago because that's fair. The majority of Chicago really don't mean that. It's just cute to say, and it reminds them of Whitney Houston, and it gives us an uplifting feel and power to the people. But it's really not what we see out here. What we see is people feeling that we are too well advanced and beyond our years, and technology is king in our world, and there is no way we can revolutionize our generations. And this is the only way we can revolutionize our generations, through the young people, even younger than myself, even the generations beyond me. And the reason I say that, you two, is because there is so much trauma and it goes so far back that it's going to take the freshest amount of trauma in the family to even understand the most veteran, the hardest in-depth trauma. It's going to take myself to understand and even educate my own grandmother about why and what is happening on the streets of Chicago, across the entire nation, with Black and brown people in the police, with our education system. She has a system in her mind where her mother was a slave. And so what she believes is very different than what I believe when we're talking about results and we're talking about outcomes. And I understand that, but see, she doesn't. And so we have to admit that that's where we are. It is in the young people. I was watching, I did some abroad.
Before you go on, I want to ask a question before we get stuck there. Dr. Sorrell and B, both of you, how then do we communicate, B, what I hear you saying? How do we communicate that back up to grandma so that she becomes an ally in this work?
And that's where that youth, that as V mentioned, becomes the conduit of change, because intergenerational trauma means also, and healing from that means helping to reset that equity for all those groups. The middle generation that thought, okay, if I'm pulling myself up by my bootstraps, if I'm doing everything right, if I'm complying, then things should work. I should
Right.
reach that American dream, and who are now stressed with, well, wait, what happened?
Right.
Helping to process that.
Right.
Helping to process that
You
and
know,
to be able to express. The
yeah.
older generation that held everything so spiritual,
Yeah.
helping to discuss and process that from a spiritual nature. Well, yes, we know that what will happen better by and by, but Jesus also said that he wanted you to have the good and the plenty and the will right now.
Right.
You know, he said that joy comes in the morning, but he also recognized that you might cry tonight, and that's okay. And that's okay. And so you use the foundations that help to support them, because certainly it was as they say, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, but their wildest dreams were held and hung through the spirituality that they knew would come to pass.
Yeah.
So we use that foundational basis as that discussion.
Oh, wow. So B, you talk about that conversation with your grandma. Do you have language for that already? It seems like something you're working on.
And you know who's helping me? My own children. Because my language won't necessarily get through, and I have to be willing to listen to what they're needing in their communities to even give that back to grandma.
Oh, wow. Now that is generational healing.
There's a funnel. Exactly. There's no way we can believe what you and I have all agreed on, and I'm sure most of our audience can relate to, that generational trauma can be passed down, but healing cannot. Healing can absolutely be passed down as well.
Absolutely.
And if we can see and understand where that starts, we have to put the faith in the young people, and we have to trust that they have the language for it.
I love it. You know, this has been such an amazing conversation, guys. I want to leave room on the back end and be mindful of our time for our audience. I know we have over 100 folks registered here today, but I just want to talk about allies. There are so many folks, different races, nationalities, ages. How do we get our allies involved? How do our allies help us here? Dr. Sorrell?
You know, I think it was a poignant moment after George Floyd's murder, where many people before may have said, okay, well, no, there was no, this was a murder. And it actually galvanized, because all of us were at home in COVID. We were all on lockdown. Everybody saw it, to say, what do we need to do and how do we start? Now we have to recognize that we have to admit the wrongs. We cannot gloss over history. We cannot pretend it didn't happen, or we certainly are doomed to repeat it. We have to recognize that all need to discuss what was done and how do we now make things done rightly. And just as it wasn't just white or black, there was Asians, Latinos, other groups within Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and how those same type of racial behaviors pit one group against another, so that they now, they can't all get along. Well, no, but if we can create strife between them, then majority groups can create those dynamics that unfortunately perpetuate issues. Now we can say we need to all come together, because all of us have strengths. Certainly, as we know in our census, all of us will be the majority in 2040. All racial groups will be, rather than white, will be the majority. So we can all rise and let all the boats float together, or each boat can be crushed independently. We need to be able to talk to say, how can we all rise and accept and work forward?
Allies, V, talk to me about how we can align our allies. And don't forget to include grandmas, because we need to know how to get grandma talking about this, when grandma is still saying, don't tell any of my business. Don't put my business in the street. And our grandchildren, or her great grandchildren, are singing a different tune about inclusion and equity and belonging. Talk about allies.
No one knows better than you in my life how soft grandmas are for their grandchildren. I'll repeat, this is not my work to do. I am doing this part because this part is for my children. So we have to pour into what's out here, and we have to not be so cocky. We've got to get out of the way.
Yeah.
You know, I need to be speaking to a Roosevelt University audience because in 5 years, my son needs to be revolutionizing society. And I need to create language for him and create legacy and a pathway for him. And so that is how we create this space. We hold ourselves accountable to give it to them. And see, grandma didn't know how to do that because my grandmother giving it to you, you weren't ready.
Yeah.
I'm not ready. We're just at the brink of this thing. And unfortunately, as Dr. Sorrell mentioned, the lives lost, George Floyd and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin, these lives that we have to mourn the ancestors and the power from the youth in the ancestral realm right now. And holding that responsible for the fight is what I'm willing to do. I ask myself often, why are we mourning our babies? Why does my mom mourn her son? Why does other mothers lose their children? That is because something about nature must realize that we need our babies at the ancestral realm. This ain't our fight. Our talk for sure, but this ain't our fight.
Along with that,
nobody can get grandma like a grandbaby. You know
That's right. Dr. Sorrell, you were going to say?
And along that,
sorry,
the fight also needs to be picked up by others.
Yep.
Truly, Black people are tired, and we're traumatized working on healing ourselves. Yes. Allyship means, and this is our Roosevelt audience, I now have to be the voice for those who are developing their own self-care and healing.
That's right.
If there's an issue that I see, I have to see something. I have to say something. If I see something, I have to say something. I have to start making good trouble. Mm-hmm. Because the movements that made change were not just movements with one group. The movements that made change were those that were in power to be able to make that change and said, I need to be this change for this other person that I see. I acknowledge the wrong, and I want it to be done, and it needs to be done rightly. Equity, from health equity to economic equity, to all of those equities come when those in the majority say, okay, this cannot continue as it has been. Yeah. And they also vouch to say, we need this to be a change.
That's right.
So that allyship is your saying, I see a wrong here. Yep. I'm going to say something. I'm going to help carry the load. I'm going to go out and march. I'm going to vote. I'm going to ask who needs to be in power to make these things different.
Yeah. And our allies, you know, are bolder today. And I want to say thank you. And I appreciate them all. Our white allies or our Asian American or Pacific Islanders, they are all standing up to say, how can I help you in this fight? Guys, we're going to get to a few questions. I see some questions starting to bubble up in the chat. But before we do that, I just want to thank you for such an amazing conversation today and ask you just what your final thoughts are, what you want our audience to walk away with today. Let's start with you, V.
There really is hope. I know it's so hard to see out there, and there was a generation prior to you who were getting sprayed with hoses and chased by dogs, and a generation prior to that who was bound by the ankles on small slave ships, and a generation before that that was on its own land in Africa prospering. So there is an outside to this pain. In my book, Hood Healing, I make sure I talk about solutions, and you're going to have to order that on Amazon in order to figure out what those solutions are. But the biggest word that comes to mind is accountability. And really being accountable for what's happening out here. Each generation has its responsibility. And I think intergenerational trauma, again, can turn into intergenerational healing if we just take our time and be honest about it, step by step.
Thank you, V, and thank you for sharing such a magnificent body of work with us today. Dr. Sorrell?
I think the message of hope and healing has to go predominant, and to remind ourselves that it starts with our own healing and hope, and that we have to practice self-care and make space for self-care. Learn to recognize if you're watching television and all of a sudden you feel your heart starting to beat faster, or you feel yourself tensing up, or you feel that pit in your stomach. Oh goodness, I hope it wasn't someone Black that did this. I hope this wasn't it. To recognize, okay, I'm getting into the yellow light. That means my pressure's going up. That means I'm getting more stressed. Learn to relax, meditate,
learn
things. You have to learn it. You have to practice it. It doesn't happen spontaneously. You have to say, how do I? And frequently, because we want media, but we frequently need to put the phone down.
Right.
we need to not scroll. We need to not doom scroll. Yeah. Turn the TV off if you feel that if you get that pit in your stomach that says, I hope it's not another. Right. Wait, I need to turn the thing else. Need to step back and recognize that those are symptoms of trauma.
Yes.
And that it's okay to recognize that you may need help for that.
Guys, I know we're gonna leave a lot of resources behind for our audience after this, but I want to jump into the questions. And one of the questions is, what is the biggest barrier that interrupts healing? What are the barriers for us getting to healing?
Part of that, as we just said, is our striving, and I believe it was V said, as we're striving to survive. We don't always recognize that self-care must be needed in order to survive and to move towards thrive.
V?
Self-care must be part of that.
Absolutely. V?
I'm sorry, the question one more time, please.
The question is, what is the biggest barrier that interrupts healing?
Shame. I think shame. I think that we are so ashamed of our past. We've been taught to be ashamed of our past. We've been made to be ashamed of our past. And when you have situations where you've dealt with ancestral rape and you've dealt with things that are just very shameful to talk about, those things are really hard to even give to a certified person who has degrees to talk about those types of things.
That's very
true. We are very ashamed as Black people. We are ashamed inside of our families, in our own homes. We are ashamed when we go to school and we can't wear the hottest next thing, or we can't afford our books. Yeah. We are ashamed in a society where we can't afford to survive. Shame. It's a hard thing to get through. It's a hard thing.
Guys, one of the questions here in the chat talks about how that trauma shows up in us. And Dr. Sorrell, I keep hearing you talk about our self-care. And then B, I hear you talking about us only knowing how to live in this responsive place. How do we even recognize the trauma that wails up in our bodies?
It's like patterns, Patterns it's one of those skills that you learn just when you're a toddler, and you learn red, blue, and you simplify patterns in your mind, but in your adult life, you abandon the need to understand and recognize patterns. As Dr. Sorrell just said, our own screens, and constantly scrolling and being addicted to being distracted. I read something that said the other day, a trauma response is always staying busy, because you're afraid if you slow down, what are you going to feel? What are you going to be forced to think about? Keeping our TVs on at night, because we literally cannot stand the traumatic silence in our own heads. Being in abusive, toxic relationships, because we do not understand how to move forward and let things go and progress beyond something that's toxic to us. These are the things that make it really hard to get past trauma.
Wow. Dr. Sorrell?
That's why it takes so much courage, but it can be so rewarding to break past that secret and to reach out for help.
Yeah.
There are a number of resources that we'll be posting to actually get help and counseling and services for trauma.
Dr. Sorrell, how do we create trauma-informed communities?
One, by acknowledging it's there and it exists, and that it's not a weakness, that we've been trying to survive so long on our strengths.
Yes.
That we're trying to pour water and our pitcher is empty. We have to have water in our own pitcher to be able to pour and share that cool water with others, which is certainly needed with our weather today.
On today. Dr. Sorrell, I hope my next question doesn't put you on the spot, but I certainly hope if it's not true that it stirs you to make it true. Someone in our audience wants to know if there is a book that you have written as well.
That's a great question. And it is going to stir me towards making one. I have several published articles on how the past cultural healing of Latinos and African Americans can be helpful for our own care now. And that how we can use that same strengths from what the ancestors gave us from Latino groups, that is on Mexican traditional medicine, utilizing herbals, utilizing spiritual statements and ritual in part of healing, can have just as much of a positive effect on healing and can work along with current medicine in a way that really works on more holistic and a holistic comprehensive approach. We've been trying as medicine, and it's discussed in one of the articles, to treat Western medicine just treats the physical organ, but we know that we have to treat the physical, the spiritual, and the mental, and the soul.
Oh, wow.
And traditional medicine practices from both Latino groups, from traditional Chinese medicine, from Ayurveda and Indian medicine, and there's traditional African healing methods are utilized now, and actually books written about by other psychiatrists that I actually just use their initial foundation to say, how do we incorporate these together so that we can have a more holistic approach to healing? Because it also emphasizes that each of our cultures brings our own healing and medicine to the table. Yes. But when we're told that it's quackery, when we're saying, well, don't go to a botanica, when we're saying don't use, when medicine is saying, oh, that stuff is old, we're using the new, but we know that that new and current medicine isn't doing the whole and healing, then we know we need a more holistic approach.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I have several articles out on utilizing.
I think there are a few folks here in this chat who have looked those articles up and located today. So.
And Dr. Sorrell is also featured in Hood Healing as the very brilliant voice that, as she's doing here today, breaks down the traumatic experiences and how it impacts us, our body, mind, and soul. Thanks, Dr.
I just want to give a shout out to Elle Winning, who just purchased Hood Healing and is looking forward to reading it. Guys, we have just a few more minutes here, and I just gotta ask you both, at the intersection of your work, how'd you guys even meet? Because I've read the book.
Sure.
I know Bee's voice in the book. Dr. Sorrell, I was introduced as this, you came to us as this powerful voice in this space. How'd you guys meet?
Dr. Sorrell is a sitting member and very great member on the West Side Heroin Opioid Task Force, where I serve as communications director. Awesome. So during COVID, the task force was convened by State Rep. LaShawn K. Ford, on the west side of Chicago. And when we would meet during COVID, she was just a little box there constantly when we had our monthly meetings. And we became acquainted when I asked her to be featured in my book. And it went from there.
And as I said and have told others, there only knows that it's a calling to come to Chicago when God brings you to Chicago during COVID.
Yep.
I have years of work along the Mexican border, working with cultural care with Latinos, also in Colorado, because people don't think of Colorado having a great, but that's the largest minoritized population in Colorado is Latinos. And so now coming here to combine that to work with Latinos, African Americans, and the full source of all that may be working and helping with healing in a holistic manner, recognizing that particularly for substance use and mental health, just a prescription, just a talk may not just do the job, that we really need to call on all the resources that are available to us and use the strengths of, as you say, those ancestors and what they knew as knowledge in really bringing a holistic type of healing approach for mental health and substance use. So I'm so happy to be here and provide those insights.
I've got this question in the chat, and I think we can all kind of speak to this, but one of our audience members is questioning the illustrations in the book, V, and talking about just how powerful those really are. Do you want to talk just a moment before we have to wrap things up here about your selection for illustration in the book?
Absolutely. One thing that one of my very favorite lifetime legends, Nina Simone, would say is that the duty of an artist is to reflect the time. And every single time I hear her voice say that, and I hear that quote or read that quote, I realize that my duty as a journalist is to document Black people. Documentation in Black life is so special because as descendants of African Americans and of the African diaspora, I realized that my documentation was stolen from my ancestors. So the words and the pictures and even the color in the book, you'll notice that I wanted to embed it in some type of gold, is really important to me because I want this to really be a reflection of right now. And it will last forever. So thank you so much for those who complimented. Awesome. It is illustrated by Raylana Johnson, a woman who lives in Chicago.
Awesome. Dr. Sorrell, a question for you. Have you included healing approaches used by Black people in the South too?
Yes, African healing methods and what we consider those traditional healing methods that include using chanting, using drums, the kind of singing and songs that occurred of what we consider the older gospel. That was actually a chanting that was a cathartic activity, just like we might now practice song as part of healing, or what Chinese traditional Chinese medicine may have used as like a bowl, those healing bowls with the sonorous bowl. That same type of chanting and the call and response of traditional Southern spirituals was part of healing technologies that were utilized. And we actually study from a research perspective so that we can say, yes, there are evidence-based, and we actually have research base to show that we include them along with traditional Western medicine, that we actually have better outcomes. So there are a number of groups and programs that use drumming, that use chanting as part of their healing process and show excellent results in improving not only outcomes, but how someone feels as part of their experience in getting care as well too.
V.L. Harrison, author of Hood Healing, Dr. Tanya Sorel from Rush Medical. Thank you, ladies, so much for your time today. The conversation has been absolutely awesome. I look forward to following your work. And let's do lunch. It's hot outside. Let's get some cold to drink.
Exactly.
Let's do that.
Sounds like a plan.
We appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Great.
Take care. Lovely to talk with you.
Thank you. Carl, what a conversation today.
Oh, you're muted, Carl.
Thank you, Sandra, so much for helping with this such meaningful discussion today and for moderating for us. So Veronica, Dr. Sorrell, V, thank you all so much for sharing your story, sharing your expertise, your insight with our Roosevelt community, and helping us to kick off our celebration of Juneteenth. You're all inspiring advocates, and you're really, really doing the work of trying to help with the healing process, and we appreciate you. So to everyone who has joined us today, we want to thank you for joining our Roosevelt community today and joining in this discussion. Happy Juneteenth. We hope that you all take time to celebrate, reflect, and heal. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth all.